Well, with that, welcome everyone and good evening. My name is Kaylee Hanson-Mahoney and I'm the president of the Alexander Hamilton Society here at Ohio State University. The Alexander Hamilton Society is an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting constructive debate on basic principles and contemporary issues in foreign, economic, and national security policy. If you're interested in joining the Alexander Hamilton Society, please find us on the Student Activities website and make sure to sign in with the QR code behind me. I'm so excited to introduce tonight's topic, Renewing America Through Innovation. We are honored to be joined tonight by David McCormick. David is the CEO of Bridgewater Associates, a global macro investment firm and the world's largest hedge fund. He served as the US Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs in the George W. Bush administration during the global financial crisis and had senior roles on the National Security Council and in the Department of Commerce. Previously, David served as CEO and then president of two publicly traded software companies and was a consultant at McKinsey & Company. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy, a veteran of the First Gulf War, holds a PhD from Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and previously sat on the board of directors of the Alexander Hamilton Society. Here to facilitate tonight's discussion is our faculty advisor, Dr. Peter Mansoor. He is a retired colonel in the US Army and the General Raymond E. Mason Jr. Chair of Military History at Ohio State. He is also a frequent commentator on security affairs in the national media, a distinguished graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point. He earned his doctorate from the Ohio State University. He assumed his current position in 2008 after a 26-year career with the US Army, including 2 combat tours and culminating in his service as the executive officer to General David Petraeus in Iraq. He is the author of the GI Offensive in Europe, Baghdad at Sunrise, A Brigade Commander's War in Iraq, and Surge, My Journey with General David Petraeus and the Remaking of the Iraq War. He also is the winner of the Society of Military History Book of the Year Award. Thank you so much to the Mershon Center and the College of Arts and Sciences for working with us to make this event possible. I'd also like to extend a special thank you to Alexander Hamilton Society Executive Director Gabe Scheinemann and the entire headquarters staff for their continued support of our chapter. Thank you all for being here tonight. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Mansoor and David.
Well, thanks, Kaylee, and thank you all for coming in tonight, either in person or virtually. We're glad to have you with us, and we have a real treat in store. Not often that you can pick the brains of the CEO of the largest hedge fund in the world, but his topic tonight will not be economics per se as much as it will be innovation. And I'll let him tell you what that's all about and tell you what's on his mind. And then we'll have a conversation. If you want to ask a question, if you're in the audience, please write it on a 3x5 card and get it to one of our officers. So David, it's all yours.
Thank you. Well, it's good to see everybody. Thanks for coming. I'll try to do my best to make this worth your time. Thank you, Kaylee, for that kind introduction, and thanks, Pete, for having me here today, and thanks, Gabe, the Alexander Hamilton Society, for hosting here at Ohio State. Alexander Hamilton Society is really an important voice for ensuring conservative ideas are debated and find their way onto college campuses, and it's been something that I've been involved with since the very beginning in 2010, I guess, when it was founded, and I'm really happy to be a big supporter of it. And I want to thank you. You know, we're 2 days away from Veterans Day, so I want to thank all the veterans in the audience, and thank you, Colonel Mansoor, for your great service. And I'm going to touch on that today because I'm going to touch on the role of veterans and the role of America in the world. I really have got 3 things I want to share, 3 points that I'm happy to follow up on in Q&A. Let me start with the first point, which is we are at a crossroads. We're at a crossroads as a country. 30 years ago from today, I was in the Army, and I was sitting on a base in Saudi Arabia waiting for the Gulf War to start. And you know, the way that all came about was I was on a training mission in Arkansas at something that was called the Joint Readiness Training Center. And we got a call in the middle of the night, go to this particular location, and the planes came in and picked up our vehicles and our troops, and we flew back to Fort Bragg. And we downloaded everything and then uploaded everything and we left. And we went to Saudi Arabia. I didn't even get a chance to call my folks. And we were the first group of troops that were there to create essentially a deterrent for Iraq coming from Kuwait into Saudi Arabia. And that all played out, and ultimately ground troops went into Kuwait and Iraq in February. And as those troops were, and I was part of that crossing the border into Iraq, what wasn't really obvious to me at the time, but is obvious in retrospect, is that at that moment, America had really cemented itself as a global superpower, really the only global superpower. And the reason I say we're at a crossroads is that moment's past. America is no longer unrivaled. China's become a very serious geopolitical competitor, and it's challenging America's leadership in the world. It's doing that through a massive military buildup. It's doing that through industrial policy and protectionism. It's doing that through industrial espionage and IP theft and other coercive tools. These are well-established facts that are proven and authenticated through all sorts of studies and work that has been done. And by its own proclamations, China aspires to dominate Asia and to really reshape the world. And America needs to respond quickly and decisively at this moment to preserve American leadership. But that's not the only challenge. Our nation also faces profound challenges at home. And those challenges really underline the very virtues that made and has made America so exceptional. The first is the loss of a distinctly American spirit of entrepreneurship and risk-taking. The second is the growing opportunity gap that really exists across our society. It exists in Ohio, it exists in Pennsylvania, and that makes it hard for many Americans today to imagine the American dream being true, which in a sentence is that every parent is confident that their kids will be better off than they are, or at least have a path to being better off than they are. And the third problem is this trust deficit, which less than a quarter of Americans believe in their government, and a similarly small number trust business, Congress, a variety of the media, a variety of other things. And worse yet, Americans have lost faith in each other and the country. As I said, they don't think their kids are going to be better off than they were. And that loss of faith and confidence really tears at the American fabric. And that's why I say we find ourselves at a crossroads. So that's my first point. We're at a crossroads. Now, the second point is don't lose faith. Don't lose faith. We've been here before, and there's a well-trodden path to renewal. Let me tell you about my hometown. So I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania called Bloomsburg. Bloomsburg is in the northeast part of the state. It's about 40 miles from Scranton. It's a tight-knit town. Everybody knew everybody, which would haunt us on occasion when we got in trouble and did dumb things in high school. And my father was the president of a little local state college, and I played football and wrestled. And it was really a wonderful place to grow up. But as I got older in high school as a teenager, I began to realize that a lot of people in my area were out of work. And as I drove from my hometown to other hometowns for football games and wrestling matches, I'd often see boards on storefronts and chains on factory gates. And by the mid-70s, unemployment hit double digit in my county where I grew up. So it was a hard time for us, and it was a hard time for the country. We had Vietnam, we had just the aftermath of Vietnam, we had the Watergate scandal, we had inflation, we had gas lines, we had the Iran hostage crisis. So things got really bad at the end of the decade. They got so bad that the president at the time, President Jimmy Carter, stood before the country and he described what was a crisis of confidence. And that crisis of confidence strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. This was the president talking. But 5 years later, while I was a cadet at West Point, it was morning in America in President Reagan's first term. Americans were back to work. The economy boomed. We began to unleash a decade and a decade after that of incredible prosperity and growth. And the military I had joined had a zip in its step. I bet you remember that. It was a whole different spirit of that time. That was 7 years later from that point, the Soviet Union fell. Now, it wasn't perfect. There was a lot of industrial towns in Pennsylvania and right here in Ohio that struggled when the steel mills closed and the factories shut down. And there was no doubt, despite all those challenges, that America was back. And I keep thinking about that moment and that remarkable turnaround in the short time frame. And I keep asking myself, what will it take for our nation to do that again? How do we repeat Morning in America? And that brings me to my third point, which is innovation. Innovation is the long pole in the tent of American renewal. Now, just look a few hundred miles from here to Pittsburgh, where I was born. You know, it's that city on the Three Rivers that regularly beats up on Cleveland, right? For those of you who are from Cleveland. Pittsburgh got hammered in the 1970s and 80s. It hollowed out. And the city basically went through another Great Depression. But in the decades that followed, it experienced a high-tech renaissance, a city-wide, region-wide renaissance. World-class universities like Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh helped create an amazing idea and talent ecosystem where the supply of talent and government and private investment came together to create something very special. And soon, firms like the one that I ultimately ran, a software company called Free Markets, began to pop up all over the city. Productivity went up, wages exploded, and the city was reborn. And today, Pittsburgh's become the city of eds, meds, and tech. It's an AI hub. It's a leading robotics research center, and it's still a core in our country for advanced manufacturing. I talked to your president, President Johnson, last week, and I know she's trying to do something like that here at Columbus with Ohio State, at the center of this innovation-driven economy, really one of the key innovation hubs in the Midwest with your innovation district. And I drove through that today, and it's super cool, and you can begin to see how 10 years from now, you could have a similar story to the one in Pittsburgh. Now, there's a tendency to want to go back to the past, to try to create the old economy and to think what worked 30 years ago might work again now. But we can't go back. Instead, like Pittsburgh, we have to create a better future across our country. We have to innovate, like we've done through many times in American history. And so, the argument I want to make tonight is that America needs an innovation agenda centered around students like you, talent like you, to help kickstart the Great American Renewal. And there are really three fundamental pillars to the innovation agenda. The first is talent. We've got to have great talent ecosystems in our country. And to have that, we need education reform. We need to reimagine education through school choice, through expanded STEM programs, by embracing diversity of opinion, like we have through Alexander Hamilton Society, and really the free exchange of ideas that this organization and this forum is trying to promulgate. We also need to expand workforce development. We've got to diversify beyond the four-year college model as well. So government and businesses need to come together to help fund training and workforce development. A traditional four-year college education is not the only path to success, and our country won't come back alive as it needs to if it remains so. The second pillar of the innovation agenda is capital. Just like in business, investing in people. Innovation starts in places like Ohio State, where talented people have access to world-class facilities, world-class infrastructure, great tools, other creative-driven people, these talent hubs. But there also needs to be funding, and I would argue a new funding model for these emergent technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum science, because they're so important. And they're kind of zero-sum in the sense that if you have national leadership in these areas, it has huge geopolitical implications, both from an economic perspective and from a national security perspective. And we're not competing on a level playing field today in terms of how China supports development in those technologies. And so we need to evolve our model to make sure we're far more competitive. And finally, we need deregulation. We need to create a regulatory and legal environment in Columbus and Pittsburgh and around the country that promotes people coming together to innovate. The third pillar is data. We live in a data age, and data is power. And data is a critical component of innovation. Now, China controls data in a very systematic way, which has all sorts of second and third order consequences for not only innovation, but also for liberty and human rights and so forth. We need to put forward our own vision for data and our own vision for tech governance, one that protects individual privacy and encourages the free flow of data among our businesses, among our universities to spur innovation. So that's the agenda that I think America needs to embrace today. Now, it's an uncertain time, but it's a super exciting time. These moments of inflection, these moments of dramatic change are always the most exciting ones. Now, I have 3 daughters in college, and I have 3 daughters in high school. And this is about the moment that they would say, wrap it up. So I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to close with 2 pieces of advice. The first piece of advice is that in the last 40 years, I've traveled to dozens of countries all around the world. And the one thing that's always clear, the one thing I've never doubted and has always been reinforced when I come back on the airplane and land in our country is America is truly exceptional. Exceptional in the world, exceptional in an absolute sense, exceptional in a relative sense. And that's worth fighting for. And that exceptional America requires innovation to ensure that it maintains its leadership. The second thing, the second lesson I want to share is that I've had the opportunity to serve. Colonel Mansoor has had the opportunity to serve. Some of you in the audience have perhaps had the opportunity to serve. If you are given the opportunity to serve, take it. And let me end where I began, with veterans. Veterans who serve us, veterans who've committed themselves to America and helping America remain exceptional. We want to give them our gratitude. And I want to give you all my gratitude for being here tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. So thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for those remarks. And we'll have a conversation up here for a good amount of time. And like I said earlier, if you have a question, write it down on this 3x5 card that hopefully you have one, and pass it to Kaylee. So let's begin with that small town in Pennsylvania. Coming out of high school, you probably had a number of choices, and you chose to go to the United States Military Academy at West Point instead of a civilian university or going right into the workforce. How did that decision come about first? And then how did your experiences at West Point and later on in the Army influence the rest of your life and your career?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Let me start with the second question. Greatest decision I ever made. Greatest decision I ever made. And what West Point put me on a path of a higher purpose, something beyond yourself, duty, honor, country, which you know well, and then the opportunity to serve in the Army, which I was from this tiny little town. And you get into the Army and it's like kids from all over the country, and they're from different socioeconomic, different race, different religion, and it was the great melting pot. And I got a sense of America through that military experience that I wouldn't trade for anything. And I went into the Army thinking I would leave after 5 years, and I left the Army after 5 years thinking that I probably should stay. I mean, it was really torn at the end. I had an unbelievable life experience, and I think it's changed everything for me. Somebody asked me earlier today about leadership, and I was saying, and you know these lessons better than anyone, but the basic things you learn, like when you're on a road march and you're walking all night and you stop, that it's your job as the platoon leader to walk along the line and check everybody's feet, or make sure everybody's okay before you sit down yourself. Or when you're in the chow hall and you go at the end of the line, or when you're bringing the team together for a mission, like those basic leadership things you learn as a young person, they carry through all your life. And I'd like to believe that it's those simple leadership lessons that have, been really core to me, and I hope I haven't lost them. But it almost didn't happen, to the first part of your question, which is I didn't have that many options in terms of where to go. I wanted to play football or wrestle, but probably football. I didn't get recruited at the places I'd hoped. I got recruited at West Point. And I said, we don't have anybody in our military in our family. My dad, as West Point is, the tuition's free. And my dad said, you don't have to go, but I insist that you apply. Just so you have the choice. But it's up to you, but you must apply. So I applied, and was pretty convinced I didn't want to go. And then I got accepted. And my little town, hadn't had anybody go to an academy for decades. And all of a sudden it just became a thing where everybody was like, oh my, isn't that great? It never even occurred to anybody I wouldn't go. And then I started to think about it differently, and I started to take it as the privilege it was, as the opportunity it was. And I, never looked back.
Yeah, I wrote in my memoir that I was raised in Sacramento, California, but I grew up at West Point.
Yeah.
And I think those things that you learn there about service, about leadership, about teamwork, they carry with you throughout your life for sure. After you left the service, by any stretch of the imagination, you were a successful financier, businessman, prior to entering the Bush administration. So what drew you into government service, and how different was it working in government versus working in the consulting industry or the financial industry?
Yeah, well, I as those government roles are very unpredictable. Particularly if you're going in a political position. If you're a civil servant, it's a normal career path and so forth. But if you're joining an administration, you don't necessarily know if those opportunities are going to present themselves. And I had always hoped that I'd have a chance to serve in government. And I sold the company that I was running in Pittsburgh when President Bush, at that time, President Bush won his second term. And I started to talk to a number of people I knew, and they said, hey, there might be an opportunity. And I started to think about it. And for me, it was that return to service. So I was excited about that, but it was a whole new world. And it was completely indecipherable. How the nomination process works, the testimony before the committees, how the government works, the interagency process, how I was at the Commerce Department, and then I was in the White House, and then I was at the Treasury in over a 4-year span. And so the first year or two was incredible because it was so much learning. And the thing that really drew me to it was, number one, the people were great. The people I worked with were great in public service. They were deeply committed. And the mission was big and important. And so I felt like I was part of something significant. And then as the way life works, I was offered a job at the Treasury Department and working for Secretary Paulson. And I considered that, I was thinking about it. And a lot of people advised me, well, don't go there. You're in the White House, stay where you are. And by the way, it's 2007 and there's not that much time left in the administration. Not much is going to happen. And so I went to the Treasury, and about the time I got there, the financial crisis hit. So I was in the Treasury Department during the financial crisis, which was one of the most amazing life experiences, scary, but an amazing life experience that, really changed everything for me.
Well, actually, tell us a little bit about the financial crisis, because, the average American will say, oh, the government bailed out the big banks and didn't do anything for us. What was it like from the standpoint of someone serving in government, looking at the potential collapse of the financial industry?
Yeah, it felt like that. In other words, it felt like a staring into the abyss of the possibility of a collapse in the financial system, a collapse in the banking system, which would have not only really halted the economy, but would have undermined confidence in America globally. And, you start to think about the human impact of that. And it's, it loomed so large. And at the time, policymakers across the political spectrum essentially agreed that the government needed to intervene in very meaningful ways. Still, even today, there's debate on what the actual scope of that should have been, and I think appropriately so. There's always good debate. I think what's undeniable is that had the government not stepped in a very profoundly powerful way, the system would have collapsed. I think there's lots of evidence for that, and that would have hurt Americans across the spectrum. Now, as you note, there's a really bad thing that happened, because when the government intervened with fiscal policy and monetary policy, which, by the way, is happening now at a level that's orders of magnitude bigger than anything that happened in 2008. But the thing that happens is that all that money flows into our economy, and it's chasing assets. That money is chasing assets. So anybody that has assets over the last 10 years, if you had a house or a second house, or if you had assets, stocks or whatever you had, it's been the best 10 years in the last 100 years to hold assets. So what does that mean? That means the people in our economy that have been the asset holders have gotten much wealthier in relative terms over that 10-year period. And that's the period we're facing another version of that right now, because what's happened is the government has intervened with fiscal policy, monetary policy, as I said, orders of magnitude of previously, and assets are reacting as a result of that. And so that creates real problems in society. I think it leads to divisiveness and polarization, and it's one of the things we need to address.
Disparity in wealth between the people at the very top and the people.
Well, the way I describe it is the biggest problem, in my opinion, is disparity of opportunity. And so, I made that point in my remarks, is that the great thing about America through all its history, I'm a good example of that, I suspect you're a good example of that, is that your mom and dad, you're raising you, and they see that if you work hard, do good stuff, you have a good chance of being better off. That was a real thing. If you were in the lowest quartile or the second quartile, you had a real shot of being in the third quartile, the fourth quartile. And there was lots of back and forth between the two, or between the different quartiles. And that's becoming less the case. It's much harder to move across quartiles. And so different people see that problem differently and the prescription differently. If you describe it the way I'm describing it, then the prescription is a real focus on making sure Americans across all those different dimensions have lots of different opportunities to be their best selves.
Let's talk a little bit about your current job, CEO of Bridgewater Associates. Most Americans think of hedge fund operators as like the modern day robber barons. If they know their 19th century history, the Carnegies or the Rockefellers who, make a lot of money, rather than as people who fill a needed function in our economic system. So I'm wondering if you could explain to the audience, what do hedge funds do, or do they fill a needed function in our economy? And what drew you to Bridgewater and the hedge fund industry?
Yeah, let me start at the highest level, which is the American economy is the most dynamic economy in the world. We're seeing that at this moment, and it's the most dynamic economy in the world because of its resilience, and its resilience in part is a byproduct of its capital markets and its financial system, its financial infrastructure, the ability to take on debt, the ability to get access to capital, the fact that businesses are allowed to succeed or fail, and that the profit motive drives that. So that the American prosperity we had is a byproduct of that capitalist system with all its imperfections. And I'm not saying there's not lots of imperfections. And there's different market participants. Banks do a certain set of things, advisors do a certain set of things. And hedge funds is a definition that has lots of different interpretations. So essentially, there is no category what everybody say is a hedge fund. What Bridgewater is an asset management firm that's managing assets for global investors around the world. And what we're doing is we're trying to build portfolios that are going to help them generate high quality returns over time. And the owners of those big pools of capital are state pension plans, teachers, firemen, policemen, their countries, their university endowments. So the big investors essentially invest in people like us to take care of their capital, treat it with great responsibility, and hopefully make it bigger. That's the purpose of it. And then how one does that is different by investment firm. So the way we do that is we don't invest in individual companies. We invest in different asset classes across capital markets, commodities, stocks, and so forth, all to generate a high quality return for our investors. So to the specific thing, yes, I do think that serves a really valuable purpose for those investors. And the reason I joined Bridgewater was I thought that it was a uniquely excellent place. I thought it had a great culture. I thought it was committed to constant innovation, and I thought it played an important role, and something I'd be proud to be part of.
Before we switch to your specific remarks on innovation, I'm going to go actually to one of the questions from the audience, and that is, with all that you have accomplished, you look back on your life, what's your proudest achievement so far?
Well, this will seem like the
besides maybe saving the U.S. economy in
right,
2008.
right. Well, it'll be one of those answers everybody roll their eyes, but definitely the family piece of it. I have six daughters between the ages of 21 and 15, and that is a handful. So just surviving that is a source of pride, and having them be great, productive people and on a good path. As a parent, it's hard to put anything above that. The thing I feel most proud of, which we talked a little bit about this at dinner, is I feel like I have never failed to sort of take the next chance. I feel like I had a goal of doing interesting things and having big impact and risking failure to do that. And I have had my share of failures, a couple big ones along the way, but it didn't deter me from continuing to follow my heart and follow my choices. And sometimes those choices work out great and you're like wildly successful, and sometimes they don't work out so well and you're not. And the difference between that one scenario and the next is it's not that big. It has a lot to do with good fortune and luck and be at the right place at the right time. So I don't look at whatever success I've had as some validation of me. I look at it as making good choices, being fortunate, working hard and trying to make the most of it.
You want to share one of the failures?
Well,
anything instructive?
Yeah, one failure, which has been written about, so I'm not really sharing anything that's not. But I've been at Bridgewater for 12 years. I've had the CEO job twice, and I was fired from the CEO job, I don't know, 4 or 5 years into it. Considered leaving, stayed, took a lesser job, but stayed committed, and then came back and was the CEO 4 years later or something. So I've been this CEO or co-CEO for the last 5 years, and there's still some debate in my mind on the actual wisdom of the firing, but in any case, there was wisdom in the feedback. There was things that I wasn't doing well enough, and I learned a lot from it, and it was a test of my grit and resilience, and I think I'm a better person because I went through it, and it's given me a lot of empathy for when people are challenged and failing.
Reminds me of something my PhD advisor once told me, and he said, your book is going to be reviewed, and you're not going to like all the comments. All feedback is useful feedback.
Right.
Let's segue.
If I could say a point on that, and that's sort of Bridgewater's culture, which is, it's essentially a feedback culture where if you're not constantly evolving, you're not improving, and the fuel for improvement is feedback. High quality, specific feedback. If you're not getting feedback, you have to ask yourself the question, is that because everything's awesome? Or is that because I'm just not getting the feedback? And so it's like being part of a high performing, people here that have played sports, if you're part of a high performing team, it's a feedback, there's a feedback culture because winning teams always are focused on getting better. And that's a big lesson from life. Sometimes hard to hear, but it's key.
You got to watch the game film.
Right.
And you have to do after action reports. General Petraeus called it the engine of change. And the fourth step was the feedback loop to make sure that you were looking at what was happening. Segueing into your specific remarks, you called America an exceptional country, and I happen to agree with you, but that's not always a term that academics, warmly embrace. So what do you mean when you talk about American exceptionalism?
Well, the fact that that's controversial is always strikes me as, sad, really sad that said, and I remember, not trying to make a political point, but I remember when President Obama made a comment at one point about, the Greeks think they're exceptional and the British think they're exceptional. And I think that the reason I made that point is that I think objectively, really in history, there's never been a country that has played such a profoundly important role in bringing stability, security, bringing free market ideas to the broader world, which has brought billions of people literally out of poverty. A country that is deeply flawed in ways that all things are flawed and has yet been on a perpetual motion machine of self-improvement, and still deeply flawed, but gets better every day. And whenever there's a setback, it comes back. And so there's a resilience, there's a genius in the design of our system by the founders that has produced, remarkable results that I think, as an historical note, are not comparable to any others. I don't mean that in a way that is, it may sound that way. I don't mean it without humility, because there's all the many challenges. But I think that accepting that premise of exceptionalism is such an important part of taking steps to ensure it remains so. And I fear that if people start to water down the belief of America's role in the world, American leadership, the uniqueness of the American model, for all its imperfections, I'm not defending the fact that it hasn't, there's not many challenges, then I think that it'll be hard to build the support for the kind of constant evolution that you need to keep it that way. So that's my view of it.
Aside from the innovation, which we'll talk about, what are some of those challenges to America remaining exceptional in the 21st century?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is finding, I think I referred to it in my remarks about building the trust in our institutions and our leaders. If you think about sort of the key drivers of change, they are institutions, robust institutions that allow change to happen and govern well. Our courts, our bodies of governance, and the right leadership across the different dimensions of our government and our industry and so forth to lead us forward. And I think that we're struggling to find our cadence at this moment. And I look at that with concern, but I don't look at it out of context. I think that if you look through the course of American history, we've had our ups and downs. And that's why I was trying to make my point in my remarks is that we're at a crossroads. Hey, we've been here before. This is not new. And always we've shown resilience and an ability to improvise and innovate and find the right leaders to take us forward. So that's why I'm both, optimistic about our future, but also thinking we need to take control of it.
We were talking about this earlier at dinner, that Americans can't agree on much these days, but they almost all universally agree that China has become a major strategic challenge for the United States. And whether you're red or blue, Democrat or Republican, they all see China almost through the same lens, that we were hoping it would become rich and therefore satisfied, and it's become rich and really not satisfied with its position in the world. So how do you see this relationship between the United States and China evolving? And is the Cold War with the Soviet Union a useful analogy, or is that actually not useful when we look at the future of the U.S. relationship with China?
Well, I put the Cold War analogy aside for a second because I think while there's parallels, I think it probably creates more confusion than clarity. But I do think that U.S.-China relations are the defining, it's the defining issue of our time. It's the defining issue of our lifetime. It has the most consequence for economics, has the most consequence for global security. It has the most consequence for the evolution of great power competition and all those things. And I think you're right. I think there was a bipartisan consensus 10 or 15 years ago on the way that both Democrats and Republicans thought we should engage with China, which has proven to be wrong. That hope and expectation and optimism about that engagement leading to more free market, opportunities, more economic integration, more political liberalization, has proven not to be true. And so I think as those validated facts, this isn't like speculation, this is, variety of intel reports and defense reports across the political continuum would validate that point that that China, poses a growing challenge in a number of different dimensions: technology, leadership, military capability. And then there's the proclamations of China's aspirations under President Xi, which are expansionist and very ambitious for its role in Asia and the world. So the facts of what China has done and where it's headed have really helped bring together the politics of parties. And I give President Trump a lot of credit here. I think President Trump came into the presidency with an expectation of resetting that. And I think if you cut through all the rhetoric, I think the Biden administration has largely maintained that same posture. And I think it's just grounded in factually how the relationships evolved. The thing that's different, that I think makes the Cold War analogy most distinctively different, is that you have these huge emergent technologies that are of critical importance to economic growth, economic vitality, and national security. So 5G, artificial intelligence, quantum science, is that economics or is that national security? It's both. And those technologies have winner-take-all dimensions associated with them. So you can't be dependent on others. If you're the United States, as you might have in the past, you must find the ability to maintain leadership in those particular areas. The fact that we are dependent on advanced semiconductors that are outside, we don't have that capability domestically, and that we're dependent on Taiwan and TSMC is an indication of how far we strayed from thoughtful policies that would ensure we had the domestic capability to maintain our leadership in technology and security.
65% of the world's semiconductors produced by corporations based in Taiwan. So we know what Americans agree on, but they disagree on a lot. And it's no secret that the political divisions in the United States are becoming deeper, that they're going to have a significant impact on our ability to confront the challenges that the century has posed, and for America to renew itself economically, culturally, spiritually. What, in your view, are the causes of these divisions, and how can we address them? How can we as Americans overcome the blue-red divide that we've created?
Well, one of the things I think has exacerbated the challenge you highlight is the opportunity gap point that I mentioned, and a really significant part of our country feeling left out. And I think you see that in the 2016 election. I think you see this huge growing division where there's a part of our country that feels like they're not being heard, being left out. There's other parts of our country that feel the same thing. They're on different sides of the political divide. So there's a sense that the system's not working for lots of people. And that's a real thing. You can't wish that away. You can't wave your hands away. And that's a very real thing. The reason I pointed to the late 70s in my remarks is if you squint at it, we would have probably been having a similar discussion in 1978, 1979. Just think about the challenges the country faced at the time. And in a relatively short period, things turned dramatically. And I think that is indicative of the resilience of the US political system, the resilience of our economy. And, I don't think there's one silver bullet. I think it's lots of steps by, great leaders across the continuum. The one thing that I feel is like, it may seem like a simple-minded idea, but most of your ideas emanate from your own experiences. But I do think it seems like a small idea, but I think it could be a very big idea, national service in some form or another. And the reason I say that is one of the things that I learned in the military, and I think you probably could say the same, is that it created this foundation of experience and expectations and common purpose for everybody. That no matter where you started, you kind of ended in the same place. The rich, the poor, the different backgrounds, South, urban, whatever. It brings people together, and that sense of common experience breaks down a lot of prejudices and expectations and so forth. And I think that we're losing that today. We don't have a shared set of experiences, a shared set of values, like those that serve in the military. That they could have very different political opinions, but they have that shared experience, which makes a profound difference in how they approach the world, how they think about their role in the country, and so forth. So that's an idea that I think might have found its time. It's an idea that's been a conservative idea for many years. William F. Buckley wrote a book about it. It's also an idea that's been a democratic idea. So I think it's an idea that maybe should and could get us moving, at least on one dimension, in a more positive direction.
I would agree. Find a way to fund it.
Right.
So let's go to the innovation agenda. You discussed what it is. What are some of the impediments to achieving it?
Well, I think it starts with sort of one of the most basic concepts, which is, China has a plan for economic technological superiority. You can actually read the plan. It exists. You could go to the 2025 plan, right, which was written in 2015, and you can see where they are relative to the plan. And it's pretty far along. It's very systematic. There's a focus, there's a plan, there's a, there may be parts of that system that ultimately won't work. You and I spoke about that, but there's a plan, there's resources, dedicated focus on it. And that's the first gap I think we have. I don't think we've organized and committed ourselves to the reality that I described and the significance of it. Let me just give you an example. Our basic R&D investment as a percentage of GDP is less than half of what it was in 1950, right? So we're spending, of every dollar, a half of the percentage we spent in the 1950s when we were thinking about the space program and all sorts of the key innovations that ultimately led us to where we are today. Now, the world's changed, there's lots of private capital and so forth, but just think about that as a canary in the coal mine of the commitment and understanding we have of the importance of innovation as sort of the long pole in the tent. And so I think there needs to be first and foremost, a acceptance, an understanding, and a prioritization of that as a really important step. And then we can get into the building blocks of that, but that's the starting point.
So it's great to have a plan. It's even better to have funding. So explain what you meant by finding creative ways to fund innovation. Industrial policy has a notoriously bad record in the United States, so I'm sure you didn't mean that. But what do you mean by it?
Well, I mean that I mean the following things. The need for some combination of private sector capital and public sector capital dedicated to these key, most strategic areas is the difference between leadership and not leadership, success or failure. So getting the right combination of capital, and that capital aligned with talent, is a prerequisite of success. But sometimes there are market irregularities, market inconsistencies, for whatever reason, capital requirements that make it really hard to get the normal market dynamics to work. The semiconductor case we talked about is probably the prime example. So here we are. Is there anybody in the leadership of our country that thinks we're in a good spot with semiconductors, right? And is there anyone who would deny that semiconductors are probably the most critical or one of the most critical strategic assets? I think that'll likely be the case too with artificial intelligence and other things. So what I'm suggesting is probably some combination of a couple things. ways to accelerate and focus private sector capital by putting a public sector focus on certain industries. So one of the things the Chinese have done as an example, not that their model is one that I would advocate broadly, but just to give you an example of what might work, they take government funding and they invest it in private sector venture funds that are dedicated to artificial intelligence. And then they cap the return on the private sector, the public capital. They cap the return at a certain level and they take first loss. So what you've done is you've not picked winners and losers, which is where industrial policy has gone astray because of course the politics eventually hijack it and you have Senator so-and-so and Congresswoman XYZ, but it begins to bring focus and clarity to the strategic sectors that are going to be so critical to our future. And it uses public sector capital to make the return on invested capital of the private sector investors much more appealing. Therefore, you draw on private sector capital, the private sector picks the winners and losers, but you have much more focus on the strategic sector. That's just one example. And the key to this, I think, is a set of principles that are constantly saying, what we're trying to do is stimulate market dynamics, but in the areas that are of most strategic significance to the country.
How about increased government funding of sort of pure science, if you will, at universities?
Absolutely. Basic R&D.
Sort of a Sputnik moment where
Yeah.
you inject money into
No,
STEM.
yeah, I'm sorry, I should have said that. That basic R&D, that's the point I was making about it's half of what it was in 1950. There should be a huge, I believe, focus on existing R&D in the public sector, combined with some sort of creative ways to ensure that private sector, that we're building on that basic research with applied research or applied investment that's yielding the kinds of outcomes that we need from an economic national security standpoint.
And maybe just a little bit of money for the humanities so we don't lose our moorings.
Well, that's why we have Alexander Hamilton Society, right? That's key. I mean, if you think about another thing to worry about, it's that, if we're not careful, we're going to lose the capacity for good, honest, open-minded debate and differing perspectives on a variety of issues around the role of the country and everything else. And so that's important. I couldn't agree more. That's both a financial thing, but it's also kind of a spiritual thing that is a risk.
So what you describe is an agenda that's very good for the United States. Where do our global allies and partners fall into this innovation agenda?
Well, from our military days, this notion of force multiplier is a really important concept. But I think first and foremost, we have to be clear that we have minimized our dependence. I think we learned during COVID, we learned a lot of things. We learned of, the innovation machine of the United States. I mean, the degree to which our pharmaceutical companies innovated on the COVID vaccine is just it's sort of, we've run past that. I think the celebration of that, what that meant, how unbelievably hard that was, we take it for granted. It's incredible. Nothing else in the world is even close. Everybody was working on that problem. So that's a validation of our innovation machine. It's also a validation or a warning of how dependent we were supply chain wise. I mean, even today, the supply chain implications are still finding their way through. And some of that supply chain stuff is just the normal inconveniences of life. And some of it's really critical to our national well-being and our sustainability and so forth. And so I think what you're seeing is a recalculation, both in the private sector and the public sector, of critical supply chains. What supply chains are we comfortable having outside the United States? And even one concentric circle outside the United States with our key allies, there's some things that we may feel comfortable with, some not. So I see our allies is a critical part of the innovation agenda because you have data sharing, you potentially have sharing of capital expenditures in some of these big areas, you potentially have of collaboration in research and science. And you can do that even in these most sensitive areas with some of our key allies, like the Five Eyes, which we do a lot of sensitive intel sharing. But I think it has to start with we have to be sure we're good. We have to be sure that we are self-sufficient, and then leveraging those partnership once more. And that you know, that did happen to some degree in the last year of the Trump administration. I'm trying to think of the name of that network, Trusted Network, right? Clean Network, the Clean Network, and that's a carry on into so there is a set of allies we can do the most sensitive things with, but I think we have to do it with a clear eye that we don't want to ever be really overly dependent on anybody.
Yeah, especially if we're dependent on, say, pharmaceuticals from India, and it has its own crisis, and
Right.
then decides to keep all the pharmaceuticals there.
Yeah.
Bad for the United States and
Exactly.
the American people.
But let's just take that example. You asked the question about the exceptionalism of America, and just even look at that, just that little example of both the creation of the vaccines, and then eventually the fact that the vaccines were shared around the world. And, you know, there was some controversy at the time, but in the end, the United States has remained both the source of leadership at a time of international or global crisis and a source of generosity. That people will read that history differently, which is why it scares me.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, thinking about semiconductors, because we were on that, is how do you bring that industry back onshore? I mean, what sort of economic incentives do you have to create to say, Intel, you're great at used to be great at producing semiconductors. Why don't you do it again?
Yeah, well, it's got to be thoughtful and creative, because you can't lose a profit incentive and the right dynamics. But the fab costs are such that they're going to have to be subsidized, because you're competing with countries around the world that are being subsidized. And it's a source of such strategic significance that we're going to have to find ways through it. And that's the kind of thing I'm saying. It's almost like the blueprint for how you map those critical areas of capability we need in our game plan for making sure we're maintaining leadership. That plan doesn't exist.
So that's the government aspect of it. How do corporate leaders like yourself, what kind of role do you play in fostering innovation? I mean, you do within your own company. Is there anything you could do on a broader scale?
Well, for me, it's a blurry line. And this is a real debate now that I think corporate CEOs are going through. And I think we're at risk. I think in the following sense, I think, and different people would see this much differently, but I think that CEOs are hired and they have a responsibility for taking care of their shareholders, taking care of their community, the people that work for them, with them, and taking care of their customers. And that's a hard triangle to get right already. You're optimizing constantly to try to make sure you're excellent to your employees, you're excellent to your customers, you're delivering an appropriate return for your shareholders. If you then add on the additional complexity and by the way, you're responsible for the challenges in society more broadly, I think it becomes a slippery slope. I think it becomes more talk than action. I think it's very hard to prioritize and so forth. Now, what I'm not saying is that there aren't key issues that CEOs should come together on. I'm not saying that they shouldn't speak out when appropriate. I'm saying it's a slippery slope. So I ask myself constantly, if I'm going to get involved in something outside that triangle, why am I doing that? Whose purpose am I serving? Do I have something meaningful to say? Can I make a difference? Is this substantive? Is this real? Because I think there's a risk, if you don't do that, of having a lot of expanding engagement and discussion around things in a very non-productive way, and in a way that really begins to undermine the role of the corporation in terms of those three edges of the triangle.
Well, you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but I think the industry that comes to mind when you talk about corporate leaders taking ownership of things that affect society would be the social media titans, and how social media has really impacted how Americans communicate with one another, how our elections are conducted, the acceptance of those elections. So, I would think that at least in that industry, corporate leaders do need to step up and take a broader view beyond shareholder value.
I do too. I think in that particular case, the thing that you're describing is an actual byproduct of the thing that they do, right? So I wasn't saying that you don't have a responsibility. That would be in sort of the customer/society bucket. And I agree with that. I think that's a real question that needs to be grappled with as a society. I know I'm just simple-minded about it. As the father of 6 daughters who are on social media all the time, I'm worried. I'm concerned. I don't feel good about it anymore. I'm not sure who's going to see them there, what they're going to do, what they're going to talk about. Like, I'm worried about what is coming. I'm not even sure that what the implications are, or even the implications are understood until many months or years down the road. So that's a particular area where I think there's a reckoning coming for the role they play in society and how they should be constrained and what their responsibilities are.
Let's take a challenge that the planet's facing right now and look at the hedge fund industry's role in it. That would be global climate change. Are there things that your industry can do to force companies to become carbon neutral, for instance?
Yeah, what's happening now is a really big shift, really big, just in the last 2 or 3 years. So if you think about one of the big ways things change, it's that, capital flows in ways that, are supportive of certain things. And so what's happened is the biggest global investors in the world, these are the sovereign wealth funds and the big pension plans, have gone from saying ESG is a priority, we're going to do something over here, to ESG is a core part of our mission. So if we had 5% of our $100 billion portfolio or 2% devoted to ESG, we now want to have a conversation about how 50% of our or 100% of our portfolio.
What's the acronym you're using there?
I'm sorry. Environmental, social governance, sustainability, the sustainability agenda, which is how investors refer to it is ESG. So there's a huge shift of thinking about that with that level of ambition, but it's early days in terms of how that's actually playing out. And so when big customers say, my goal is to have a much more sustainable portfolio, and that's coming mostly because of political interest or political pressures on them, then what happens is they say to places like Bridgewater or any other big investment manager, hey, we need help with that. And then what happens is you develop products that meet their needs. And so those products that meet their needs help them achieve a sustainable portfolio. And that means they buy certain things and they don't buy other things. And that's ultimately a big mechanism in terms of so that's what we've done. We've done a lot of thinking about how to make that a real, a really substantive opportunity to serve their needs. But one of the challenges is everybody's goal is different, and everybody's definition of what good or not good is different. And so the way we've tried to do that is without judgment. We've basically said, okay, here's the ways that you could achieve sustainability, and everybody defines it different. So you can dial this up and dial that down, and you could basically settle on the assets that you want to hold that meet your objectives. And I think you're going to see, over the next decade, a pretty substantive shift in where capital goes based on those criteria.
Okay, well, I'm out of my questions. I've got a few from the audience, unless you have anything that you're dying to say about innovation that we haven't covered yet.
No.
So a couple of questions on the financial crisis, a lot of interest in this. And the question is, did we learn our lesson? And if we did, what were those lessons?
Well, the thing about a crisis is it's, you learn the lessons of the last crisis. So you've essentially taken steps to avoid the thing that happened the last time, but crises by nature show up in surprising ways. And so I think that there's been a lot of changes made as a consequence of what happened in 2008, 2009, in terms of capital requirements for banks and in terms of transparency in the regulatory landscape and so forth. Some of those I think were good changes, some of them maybe not so good, but there was certainly a lot of work done that I think most commentators would say, yeah, we are safer. We are safer in guarding against that thing that happened before. But I don't think that should give us confidence that we're always safe. You know, there's got to be a lot of creativity and thoughtfulness on the part of business leaders, but also on the part of regulators to not be overzealous, but be thoughtful about all the the three steps forward that could possibly go wrong. And so that's how I would assess that. And then crises more generally are something that I do think we've learned a lot from, and maybe some of the wrong lessons. So in this particular case, if you look at what's happened in COVID, there's been an enormous amount of response. We now know how to, from the 2008, 2009 experience, we now know how to respond. But because monetary policy is increasingly less effective, we've had to use fiscal policy. We call it monetary policy 3, MP3. So we've transitioned to that. So you're seeing an enormous amount of fiscal spending. And that fiscal spending is coming in the form of, checks for people and all sorts of other things at an enormous scale. And we don't know, but we can speculate the second and third order consequences of that, which may actually end up being more challenging than the initial problem you're trying to solve. So inflation is a good example of the risk on the horizon, the indebtedness that's a result. So you have to be careful that in your response to the crisis at the moment, you not only learn some lessons that avoid that crisis, but you also don't create a new set of challenges.
Well, we've learned that both parties are addicted to debt. It doesn't matter which one is in office. And that will be something I think that we're going to have to deal with at some point. During the financial crisis, how difficult was it to find balance between dealing with that crisis and maintaining a government budget that met the government's needs, defense, domestic priorities, and so forth?
Well, in that particular instance, I don't think there was even any trade-off. I mean, I think it was incremental spending. No one said, should we invest in the financial crisis versus defense or something like that. You know this area better than I. I think when you think about defense spending, there's sort of two questions. It's how big is the number, and then how is it getting allocated, right? So the lack of freedom, at least through my eyes, the lack of flexibility in terms of constantly reinventing how that money is allocated has made it hard to drive the kind of innovation in defense over the last decade or so that I think is probably needed.
You have any thoughts on defense priorities going forward?
I don't have specific thoughts on this versus that. The point I was making to you earlier is that I think the challenge for driving innovation is a combination of and reformation is a combination of resources. It's a combination of structure and design in terms of how decisions get made, and it's a combination of the right cultural alignment. The right cultural alignment in the officer corps, the right cultural alignment in the civilian. And questions, you're more of an expert than I do, around whether the military rewards the kind of innovation in its uniform ranks that are necessary to sort of drive the next generation. There's been lots written on this by a number of academics, but the reward system, the degree to which failure is treated in terms of promotion, and the fact that anybody that's ever been in a truly innovative organization knows that part of the deal is failing, and the failing leading to learning. So bringing that kind of thinking, the creative destruction, you got to break it to get to the next step. You're essentially constantly reworking the core budget and allocating to new businesses because that's what's required. It's just very hard to do that within the ecosystem that is defense. The way funding works with Congress, the way the budgeting process works with the primes, and the role that the officer corps plays in adopting new ideas. So I'm skeptical, put me in the skeptic category, but not that informed, but that would be a worry.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I'm wondering if you could give the students some life advice. One of them has asked, how do you get into the hedge fund industry? I would go beyond that and say, should they go into the hedge fund industry? I always, when students come to me and say, I'm unsure of what to do after graduation, I say, well, don't do more schooling. go off and do something, join the Peace Corps, teach for America, get a job, go hike the Alps if you want to, but do something else for a couple of years, and then you will be in a better place mentally to go back to graduate school later on. Is it wise for someone to come right out of Ohio State, go to the Fisher School of Business, get an MBA, go right into the financial industry, or is that a path you would support?
Well, I'm more inclined to think what you think, which is, have an adventure, pick things and do them well. Don't be overly confident that you've on the right path. Be open to new things that come. I'm always a little skeptical when I meet somebody who's early in their career and they say, in 20 years, I want to be this. Therefore, I have to do this, and then I have to go to B school and do that. And it's like, okay, that's unfortunate, because you don't even really know the thing that you want to do, whether you like it. And by being so narrowly focused on that, you're unlikely to see the peripheral opportunities that present themselves. So that's point one, is I think be open to new doors. Sometimes things don't work out here and new doors open. That's happened to me a lot of times, where I thought I was going to do something, it didn't materialize. And the thing that materialized when the other thing didn't materialize was a total adventure. So I think openness is really important. When I do interviews all the time with people your ages, and over time, the resumes, honestly, they all start to look the same. And what I'm looking for is somebody interesting. I'm looking for somebody who did something different. I'm looking for somebody who took a chance. I'm looking for somebody who failed and got off the mat. I'm looking for somebody who I want to have a 20-minute conversation over beer and say, hey, tell me about that. That seems so interesting. So don't get caught up in the you have to do this, and this, because first of all, it's not a fun way to have your career, and you miss sort of the lateral possibilities that present themselves. So that's the second thing. I'm not going to take the bait on the hedge fund thing, other than to say the following. I think it all comes down to really three things. I think it comes down to purpose, a sense of purpose. Are you part of something that's beyond what you're doing? Do you see that you're part of something exciting? I think work is more fun, life is more fun when it's bigger than just you. So that's a big part of it. Are you around people that are great? Are you around people that are great? And I mean great in the honorable integrity. Like this is somebody I'm proud to be part of. Like if you're not proud to be with the people you're with, you probably are not at the right place, right? Are you proud of those people? Are you proud to be part of the organization? Do you wear it with pride? And then the third thing is it an environment that makes you better? Like if you're not getting better, you're sort of getting worse. It's like skiing. If you're not falling early on, you're not doing enough. And that's the way I think your careers are, particularly early on. We got to push yourself and be in a place where you're tested and challenged, and you always sort of feel like, oh, that's a little too much. And if those three things don't exist, then I don't think you're likely to. They're not always perfect. They don't exist always at the same level. But those would be what I'm seeking. And I think that's the path to fulfillment.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to leave off. Before I turn it over to our student president, Kaylee, on behalf of the Ohio State chapter of the Alexander Hamilton Society and the American Foreign and Military Policy Cluster at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, thank you all for coming this evening. I think we had a fascinating conversation with one of the leading business executives in America, and appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you.
And good luck on your future endeavors. Kaylee, take it away.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you both for such an engaging discussion. And David, I really appreciate you making time to speak with students. You're a very busy guy, I'm sure, and it means a lot that you would be here with us tonight.
My pleasure.
And to everyone in the audience, thank you so much for making time to come tonight as well. And I hope this makes you think a little bit more deeply about America's role in the world and maybe your role in America. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.